Go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 23. That's where we'll begin. Exodus 23. So I posted a revamped outline of what we started last week, which is I redid the way I do it a little bit. So if you're in the building, you've received one, I think. If you're at home, I posted it just before services. I originally posted one that was 200 pages long. That was not what we're covering. It was duplicated 20 times, and so I feel bad about that. But it's 10 pages, and that is the whole of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books that we're studying. And my goal is to finish that tonight, and I think we will no matter what, because we have the handout. And so if you have that in hand, that's great. We stopped last week right at number 10, which is the expanded law, I think. And so if you find that, it is 21 through 23 chapters of Exodus. It's really through 24. And so I made a mistake there already, and I want to take them all back and redo them. I also separated the introduction, which we've already gone through. And so I didn't hand that out again tonight. My goal would be not to hand you a handout every week, but to give you the whole of history, and the whole of poetry, and the whole of major prophets, and the whole of minor prophets, and then we'll work through those outlines. That means I have to get far enough ahead to be able to do that, and there's a good chance I won't be able to do that, but that's my goal. And so tonight, we'll finish Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which is a lot. And by the time we finish the Pentateuch, we've covered about 3,000 years of history of the world. If you begin with creation, give or take, I don't know how long man was in the garden, and it doesn't really matter, but you got 2,500 years or so in the book of Exodus, and then you got a few hundred years, 400 years in Egypt, 2,500 years in the book of Genesis, 400 years or so in Egypt, probably 430, another 40 years or so wandering, and as we finish tonight, they are just on the border of entering the promised land. And Moses can see it, but he can't go in. And that's where we kind of end things. And I meant to have a timeline, but I don't. And so next week we should have a timeline that will kind of break down the Pentateuch, where it lands on a timeline of the world, and then start into the next sections as well. Before we begin our introduction, there are a couple things I want us to review. There are 39 books in the Old Testament. Does anyone recall and would like to share how those are broken down, the number sequence that we used last week and the week before? Starts with a 5. 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. And the first 5 is the Pentateuch. What is the 12 that comes after that? Okay, so 5 for the Pentateuch, 12 for history, 5 for poetry, 5 more for major prophets, and then 12 for minor prophets. Why are the major prophets called major prophets and the minor prophets called minor prophets? The books are longer in the major prophets, and so they're major, they're serious, they're big. And the minor prophets are not younger guys, they're just smaller books. We talked about all kinds of themes, and I think we have all that pretty well. The greatest theme that we find throughout the entire Bible, if there was a one-word answer for the greatest theme that there is, what would that theme be? Jesus, or Christ himself. It's all about Christ. It is that he's coming, it is that he's here, it is that he's coming again. If you go cover to cover, index to maps, as some people would say. And then we went through the book of Genesis. We covered all of that. We've seen from the garden is where Genesis starts, or creation is where it starts. Where does it end? Geographically, where are we when the book of Genesis closes? Where are God's people when the book of Genesis closes? Egypt. It begins with creation and the garden. It ends in Egypt. And then we get to Exodus, and it begins in Egypt, right? Hundreds of years have passed, but now the people are about to exit. We can remember Egypt. And so they do, and they head out, and by the end of Exodus, we'll see, they're basically at the base of Mount Sinai, getting the law from God. And so we're in 23. There was one question last week that I want to talk about very briefly. We talked about as they left Egypt, there was this mixed multitude with the Israelites. And I've always found that fascinating. The way we talked about it in class was that it's people other than Israelites left Egypt with them. And so all the plagues happened. The Egyptians are devastated. Their crops are devastated. And now they're headed out of town, and they're giving all their gold and silver to the Israelites. And beyond just the Israelites, there's this mixed multitude. And Jolene asked if that is the rabble that we read about later. And I should have written this down, but it's in Numbers chapter 11 and verse 4, maybe? Does that, anybody? Sorry, I should have, that's not right. Let me see. Oh, man. That is? Okay. So Numbers, the book of Numbers 11 and verse 4 says, "The rabble who were among them had greedy desires, and also the sons of Israel wept again and said, 'Who will give us meat to eat?'" And so there's the rabble that she was asking about. My Bible even footnotes rabble, and it takes me back to the mixed multitude that left Egypt. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 38 is where it talks about that. And so are they the same people we're talking about? Perhaps. I don't know that we know any more than there's a footnote. But in my mind, I think in Egypt they would have had a lot of slaves. We know they had the Hebrews as slaves, but I don't think they were limited to only the Hebrews. When Joseph was sold into slavery, I don't think it was like the Egyptians only took Hebrews. They were just buying slaves. They didn't care. And it turns out the whole of Joseph's family ended up in Egypt. And so when they left, if I'm a slave in Egypt and I see all the Israelites are leaving, and they do a lot of work around here, and now it's going to be me and my other slave friends working for the Egyptians, there's a lot more work to do for a lot less people. I'd be joining the party. I'd be getting out of town as fast as I could. And so I've always imagined that it's that. It's the downtrodden, enslaved people of Egypt said, "We're out of here. I'm not sticking around to see what happens next. This Moses guy, he's got something going on." And then I can imagine later when they're all grumbling that these are the rabble that we talk about in chapter 11. Any thoughts or comments before we kind of get back into our study? Tonight's study, I should say. Anything at all? Okay. So, in the book of Exodus, we've made it a little more than halfway through, I think. It begins in Egypt and it ends at Mount Sinai. They begin in slavery and bondage, but they end in the presence of God with the tabernacle being built. That's how far they come in this book. And again, the key to the book is the redemption of God's people. We talked very briefly. The key verse is Exodus chapter 5 and verse 2. "But Pharaoh said, 'Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and besides, I will not let Israel go.'" And God dismantles the religion of Egypt with those plagues, and he proves exactly who he is in the book of Exodus. Not only to Egypt, but to Israel. They've gone hundreds of years without hearing from God, and they've surely talked about the day when they would be delivered from their bondage, but the day has finally come. The book, very quickly, talks about the early life of Moses. We see the burning bush, and then there's the 10 plagues. We're familiar with those. The Passover at that last plague. Then the Exodus occurs. They make it to the Red Sea. They cross the Red Sea. The Sabbath is first observed there in chapter 16. Manna, you remember, comes from the sky or picks up on the ground. And they were told to pick up twice as much on Friday because on Saturday, the seventh day, they were not to pick any manna up. That would be the Sabbath. 3 months after leaving Egypt, they're at the base of Mount Sinai. In Exodus chapter 20, Moses receives the 10 Commandments. And then 21 through 23, that law is expanded. We start with just those 10 sentences, but we know there's a whole lot more to God's law than those 10 sentences. And I'm going to read a couple verses. If you're in 23, I hope you'll read along with me. But in 23, Beginning in verse 10, talking about the Sabbath. You shall sow your land for 6 years and gather its yield, but on the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, so that the needy of your people may eat, and whatever they leave the beast of the field may eat. You are to do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. 6 days you are to do work, but on the 7th day you shall cease from labor, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the son of your female slave, as well as your stranger, may refresh themselves. Now concerning everything which I have said to you, be on guard, and do not mention the name of other gods, nor let them be heard from your mouth. If you skip down to verse 20, behold, I'm going to send an angel before you to guard you along the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. Verse 31, I will fix your boundary from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the river of the Euphrates. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you will drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them or with their gods. They shall not live in your land, because they will make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. And so he establishes the Sabbath, and he gives them the reasons for it. Leave the crops that 7th day. Don't pick anything. Let people who are in need take what they need. Let the animals eat. All of this common sense stuff that they needed to be told by God. God lays that out for them. And then he starts talking about this journey they're going to take into the promised land, and that he's going to clear the path for them, and they're not supposed to make a covenant with any of the pagans that would be in that land. And so the people who aren't God's people. And the reason they're not supposed to make those covenants or deals with them or treaties with them is because they're going to cause them to sin against God. And we see that throughout the Old Testament. But you see this theme that God is laying out for his people. In 24 and verse 18, Moses entered the midst of the cloud as he went up to the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. And we see Moses there on Mount Sinai with God. Chapters 25 through 31, you see the tabernacle, and the instructions for the tabernacle come from God. I wanted to read a little bit in 31. 31 in verse 12. The Lord, again about the Sabbath, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, But as for you, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, You shall surely observe my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know me, or that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. Therefore you are to observe the Sabbath, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. Whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. For 6 days work may be done, but on the 7th day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath shall surely be put to death. So the sons of Israel shall observe the Sabbath to celebrate the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the sons of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, but on the 7th day he ceased from his labor and was refreshed. When he had finished speaking with him on the mountain, or on Mount Sinai, he gave Moses 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written by the finger of God. So again, you see the Sabbath laid out. You see the explanation for it from God. And you see how serious God takes that command. Anyone who violates the Sabbath is going to be put to death. And as God finishes speaking to Moses, he gives him these 2 stone tablets written by the very finger of God, which is pretty incredible. And you would think that Moses would be in awe of that at that moment. Any comments or questions on any of that before we continue on? Chapter 32, we come to the golden calf, which I know we're familiar with. We talked about it even on Sunday. As Moses comes down from that mountain, the very first couple of verses. Now when the people saw Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled about Aaron and said to him, Come and make us a god who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him. And Aaron said, Tear off the gold rings which are in your ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me, and the rest is history. They said, We don't know what happened to Moses. He's been up there a long time. We need something to worship. And so Aaron, make for us a god. They do that. They have that golden calf that we're familiar with. God tells Moses up on the mountain, you need to get down quick because those people have made this molten image and you need to take care of this. I'm ready to destroy them all. In verse 10 of that chapter 32, now then, God says, let me alone, that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them, and I will make of you a great nation. But then we see as Moses negotiates with God, he begs God, pleads with God, don't destroy these people. And he gives two reasons not to destroy them. He says, number one, just think what the Egyptians will say. If they find out that you did all of that work in Egypt, and you devastated that nation, you take them out into this wilderness so they can worship you, and then you end up destroying them. They're just going to think you're evil. And think about the promise you made to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that their descendants will be, like the stars of the sky and all of that. If you destroy these people, you're not keeping that promise. And the Bible says that God changed his mind because Moses interceded for the people, which is pretty remarkable. And it's hard to wrap my head around God changing his mind, but that's what the Bible says. It's accommodative language at some sense because God knows what he's going to do, and it's for us to understand. But we actually see that event unfold another time in the Old Testament as well. They just continue grumbling. God says, I'm done with these people. Moses says, hold on. What about Egypt? What will the Egyptians say and all of that? After chapter 32, 33, they're now headed to the promised land. They finished up at Mount Sinai. They're preparing to leave town. In chapter 34, the Ten Commandments are replaced. The second copy, or the first copy of the first. This time God had Moses do some of the work. And in chapter 36 through 40, we see the construction of the tabernacle. And remember, the tabernacle was the precursor to the temple. It's a tent, portable temple, if you will. And God had very specific design instructions. In chapter 40, and turn with me there as we come to the end of Exodus. In chapter 40, finally, we see God's presence among the people. In chapter 40, beginning in verse 34, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Remember, the tabernacle has the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat on top, where God would dwell in the most holy of holy places, where they could only go once a year. That is the presence of God. Let me read that verse again. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, wherever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, the sons of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out until the day it was taken up. For throughout all their journeys, the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and there was fire in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel. And so, as big as this nation of people is, maybe 2 million people out in the wilderness, wherever you are, you can see where the tabernacle is a cloud, a pillar of cloud, a cloud that's there, that's God's presence, or fire at night. And so you always know that God is in your presence there. Or you're in the presence of God, that he's among you. That reminder for 40 years as they wandered in the wilderness. Again, God brought Israel out of bondage, and now God dwells in the presence of Israel. That's how far they've come in the book of Exodus. Any thoughts on that? Questions or comments before we move? 32? So God wanted to destroy the whole of the nation, every one of them. Stop, forget what I said, let's start over, redo. And Moses, said, hold on, don't do that. Moses comes down and realizes, before that, Moses had already realized what they're doing. He's already broken the Ten Commandments, which, by the way, I get angry sometimes, and I used to put my fist down like that real hard when I get, about my tongue. That's my most infuriating moment. And Julie will make fun of me, and I tell her I haven't done it in years. But Moses threw down the Ten Commandments on the ground. He didn't even get in trouble. So I'm just saying, people get mad sometimes. Moses, he broke the Ten Commandments. God never got onto him for it. Later he says, now you're going to make some more. But he got really upset that they had that calf. Some of them were slain for that.
So I guess when I read that, I think, Moses
What verse are you looking at?
Like in 25 of chapter 36. Like when does he send somebody out to kill some of them? Kill some of the people that were naked? And that they were worshiping the idols?
Yeah, so let me read 25 and following. Now when Moses saw that the people were out of control, for Aaron had let them get out of control, to be a derision among their enemies, then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." And all the sons of Levi gathered together to him. And he said to them, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, every man of you put his sword upon his thigh and go back and forth from the gate to gate in the camp and kill every man his brother, every man his friend, every man his neighbor." So the sons of Levi did as Moses instructed, and about 3,000 men of the people fell that day. It is because of the golden calf. I think Moses had the authority to do that clearly. And I think he understands what God desires and the anger of God enough to make that decision. But there's a lot more that comes from Moses and God, a lot more death to come than that. That's the tip of the iceberg, really. Jolene?
Why wasn't Aaron?
Yeah.
Why wasn't Aaron held more accountable?
So, and this was brought up too, we were talking about it Sunday a little bit. Why wasn't Aaron held more accountable? Aaron's the one that fashioned the calf. He said, "Hey, go bring me the gold." And I'd love to hear someone's thoughts. What I know what happened to Aaron is he became, he got in trouble a couple of times, but he's the high priest. And he's not really spoken poorly about. He didn't get to go into the promised land, but it wasn't because of this. But I think I don't know why it didn't happen here. I mean,
To me, he was a very weak leader.
God didn't choose him to lead to start with, right? He chose Moses, and Moses said, "I can't do this, and I can't talk very good." And so here's Aaron. And he's really this mouthpiece, but he's kind of become more. They look to him for more than they probably should have. That's a fair point. Anybody else? Any thoughts on that? Terry doesn't want people to die. Jolene's like, "Why aren't more people dying?" So I'm starting to understand the crowd here. I would have thought it would be the other way around, but just kidding. Okay, that's the book of Exodus then. And let's move on and see if we can get through 100 more chapters before this is over. Once we get through the Pentateuch, which we'll finish tonight, we will methodically hit more stuff because it becomes much more complicated when you get into the history. All right, Leviticus is a book written by, again, the author is Moses. The author of all 5 of these is Moses. The book begins in the Greek translation, the early Greek, as pertaining to the Levite. And remember, the Levites are the tribe where the priests would come from. Every priest in the tabernacle or in the temple was a Levite. Every Levite was not necessarily a priest, but you had to be a Levite in order to be a priest. And in the book of Leviticus, there's a lot of instruction for the priests and for worship, how to do those things. The purpose of the book, as I have it written, is God gives instructions to the priests for cleansing themselves so that they can approach the altar of God in order to make the nation of Israel holy in the sight of God through the offering of blood sacrifices. And that's really what happens in the book of Leviticus. A lot of regulations for the priests, a lot of regulations for sacrifices, how those are supposed to be done. There's a distinction drawn between clean, holy, and acceptable, and unclean, unholy, and strange. You see words, and you can see on the list there, altar and offering and sacrifice and priest, really hundreds of times throughout this book. It's all about worship. It's all about coming before the Lord, offering that sacrifice to get his people holy, being able to approach the presence of God. 2 key verses in chapter 19 and verse 2. We read, "Speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." And in the next chapter, "And you shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples, that you should be mine." And we know that theme generally, that God has chosen these people and he's separated them from the other peoples. He wants his people to be holy. And he wants to dwell among his people. And he wants his people to be close to him. And the book of Leviticus is explaining how that can be possible. There's an outline there of the book. and it's pretty quick because I don't have a lot of details on this book. But it goes through the sacrifices and the establishment of those sacrifices. The burnt offering, the meal offering, the peace offering, sin offerings, trespass offerings. Those are the first 5 chapters or so. The roles of priests are defined in chapters 6 and 7. Aaron, the brother of Moses, and his sons are consecrated in chapter 8, and Aaron in chapter 9 becomes the first high priest of the people. And the high priest would have certain obligations that only the high priest could do, and Aaron is the first. Remember Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, they went in and offered strange fire to God, and in chapter 10, first few verses there, and they were put to death for that. There's a lot of debate, not a lot of debate, there's some discussion as to what strange fire is, and a lot of times, and I kind of think they were probably intoxicated, because after that happened, the new rule was priests can never drink alcohol, and that wasn't the rule before. And so my opinion is they got a little tipsy and then went to worship, and probably not a good idea to worship God when you're drunk. You might make a mistake and offer strange fire. And so I think that's what you kind of see in Leviticus. Either way, what you see is God has a certain way that he wants to be worshiped, and when you come up with something different that is other than what God commanded, God has a problem with that. And we see that with Nadab and Abihu. Chapter 11 through 20, he separates the clean and the unclean. And we're familiar with those from the New Testament even, right? Certain animals they could eat, certain animals they couldn't eat. Bacon, no bacon. Talks about the diseases, and there's all kinds of sanitation descriptions. And we talk about leprosy in those chapters. In the 23 through 25, we talk about feasts and fasting. They have a Sabbath day of the Lord. They have a Passover feast. They have a feast of the first fruits. They have a feast of Pentecost, which is 50 days after the Passover. They have the Feast of Trumpets. They have the Feast of Tabernacles. There is the most holy day in the Jewish religion, which is Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, and that is this year in September. Those dates are for when they are going to see it this year. And the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, which is tents, commemorates the wilderness wanderings. We read that in chapter 23. In chapter 25, it talks about the sabbatical year, and it talks about it in a couple places. But every 7th year, the Sabbath would be on the 7th day. That's when they would rest. Every 7th year would be a sabbatical year or a Sabbath year, and they would really do the same thing in a sense, and they would let the soil rest for an entire year. There would be no farming. There would be no harvesting. You would just let the soil sit. And the reason for that, you'd let the soil recuperate. You would also rest and remember that God's in control. Can you imagine how dependent you'd be on God if every 7 years you said, look, we're not going to do a thing. We're going to let God take control. We're going to remember that he is in control. It's the same principle as a Sabbath day, except on a grand scale. And so in the 6th year, they would harvest 3 times as much to last them for the 7th year and into the 8th year when they're growing the crops and they don't have food for that year. So all by God's design. And then, let's see, chapter 25. Turn to Leviticus 25 there, if you're not there. Leviticus 25 and verse 18. You shall thus observe my statutes and keep my judgments so as to carry them out, that you may live securely on the land, that the land will yield its produce so that you can eat your fill and live securely on it. But if you say, well, what are we going to eat on the 7th year if we don't sow any or gather in our crops? Then I will so order my blessing for you in the 6th year that it will bring forth crops for 3 years. And when you're sowing in the 8th year, you can still eat old things from the crop, eating the old until the 9th year when the crops come in. So that's the Sabbath year. And then there is the year of Jubilee. And it is the 50th year. And every 50th year, it's like the greatest Sabbath year ever. All the land reverts back to its original owner. All the debts are canceled, basically. If you're in slavery, you're set free. Everything is restored every 50th year by God's design. To my knowledge, that was never observed by the nation of Israel, and I don't think it ever was. This is when they get into the promised land. These are the things they're supposed to do. God's going to give you this land, so you take care of it. And God's going to portion up the land to different families, and that's your portion. That's your inheritance. You take care of it. And on the 50th year, we'll revert everything back to how it should be. And that takes a lot of faith in God to say, this is what God's word says. The whole nation is going to turn over their slave or cancel their debts and all of that. But that's by God's design, because he wants them to depend on him. But they never did, as far as I know. There's a chance they may have, but I don't think we know that they did. At the end of that book, there are some special laws in 26 and 27, and then it talks about vows and tithes in chapter 27, and that's the book of Leviticus. Any thoughts on Leviticus? I know, but I got 5 minutes. So, hold your horses, whoever that was. Just kidding. The book of Numbers is all about numbers, and we won't finish it because I wanted to read several little passages here, but and we got to cover Deuteronomy too, so hang on. But the book of Numbers, to quote my friend, I've told you before, but in college, one of my best friends was reading through the Bible in a year, and he got to Numbers, and I remember him coming to my room and saying, Numbers is a drag, and he just couldn't get into it. And it's because it starts with a bunch of numbers. It just lists a census is being taken of the families, and it's being taken so that they can number themselves, so God knows, and they divvy up how many people are in each family, but to prepare themselves for war. They're headed to the promised land, and they're going to take on the enemies that are there, the Canaanites that are there. They're going to remove them from the land, but before they go, they need to know how many fighting men do we have. And so the book of Numbers is really a lot about numbers. It's also about the indestructibility of God's plan. No matter how much these people complain and no matter how much they rebel, God is going to fulfill his plan. And we see that in the book of Numbers. It also is about the fact that there are consequences to sin. And when we rebel against God, there's going to be a consequence to that rebellion. And again, throughout the entire book, that's what we see. It's actually a really exciting book if you get past the numbers of the book of Numbers. They first numbered, there's 603,000 of them, 20 years or older. They list every tribe. The Levites are the 13th tribe. They're not counted in the first census, and they'll be ended up given cities to live in, but they're not given a portion of land like the other tribes. They're given tribal positions at this point. The tabernacle is here, and each tribe has a place to camp around the tabernacle. And again, you can imagine there's millions of people maybe. They're traveling in this big caravan, and they all have a spot to be, just like when you go to the, what's it called, the KOA? Is that what the campground's called? And you get spot 32 or whatever. They all had their spot as well. And you want to be close to the tabernacle. That's where God is, but not everyone is close to the tabernacle. The responsibilities of the priests are laid out. The priests are all Levites, but they have different roles. And there are 3 families there. The Kohathites are in charge of carrying the most holy things. And so when the tabernacle is about to move, Moses would cover everything up, and then the Kohathites would come and they would carry the Ark of the Covenant. That was their job. They wouldn't touch it. They'd stick poles in the whatever, grommets or whatever, and carry the Ark and the other most holy things. The Gershonites carried all the curtains, the coverings, and the hangings of the tabernacle. And the Merarites carried the boards, the bars, the pillars, the sockets, the pegs, and the cords. And so God laid everything out for them, very detailed in what he did. In chapter 6 of the book of Numbers, there's the Nazirite vow. In chapter 12 of the book of Numbers, Aaron and Miriam, the brother and sister of Moses, they speak badly about Moses. They start to question him, and it really makes God mad. Miriam gets leprosy on her hand or her arm. And Moses begs God to heal her, and God says, I can't remember his exact words, but it's something like, even whatever criminal gets 7 days of punishment, and she has to sit out of the camp for 7 days. But it shows how serious God is, and how serious he is about his servant Moses. In chapter 13 and 14, the spies now venture into the promised land. They're almost there, right? They've left Sinai. They've traveled to the promised land. They send these spies into the promised land, and man, they see amazing things. They see a cluster of grapes so big that 2 men carry it with a pole, and they bring it back, I think, to show everyone the fruit is so large, and the people there are giants, and it flows with milk and honey. What a wonderful place, but there is not a chance we can conquer the land. And there were 2 spies who disagreed. Do we recall the names of those two spies?
Joshua and Caleb.
Joshua and Caleb said, we can do it. Hold on, guys. Slow down. And so there is this big rebellion among the people. And the other spies, the 10 spies, are put to death, but those two are rewarded. In chapter 16, if we continued on to the book of Numbers, we see Korah's rebellion. And again, there's this guy Korah who is a cousin of Moses. And he says, why do you get to be the guy that talks to God? Why do you think you're so important, Moses? And so God makes a very clear distinction between Moses, his servant, and Korah. And Korah is over with his tent and his family, and the ground opens up, and Korah and all his family fall down into the earth, and they're gone forever.